that has been running. We were first thinking about it for a couple of years, but now it's been running for 3 years, almost. And it's a project on project on the land rights and sustainable inclusive development in federal India. And I want to start by saying a little bit about the reason why we think this is a very important topic to investigate, not only in India but also comparatively, but in India. The Indian state has been pursuing a very a development path that has concentrated a lot of large infrastructure projects that needs a lot of land. And that is one of the reasons why we see a lot of shifts in land ownership, but also in the rules for land ownership in India. And at the same time, there are laws in place to protect vulnerable populations and also to protect vulnerable environments that are interacting with other forms of law in ways that we don't really know much about in various parts of India, and it varies because the laws are really different in different states. And one of the things that we knew beforehand, but we really learned a lot about while we've been doing this project, is that it's really complicated and it looks very different in different parts of the country. I remember we were just starting and Namita was saying, we're already up to more than 100 laws. We've just started counting and there are more than 100 laws regulating land in this area. Because we have all kinds of different laws. And we've had a really interesting journey where all kinds of groups are really interested in research, including the government, because they don't really know a lot about what the situation is. And at the same time, there are a lot of initiatives at various levels to have new legislation for land acquisition, for instance. So this is a very intense debate. So this project started from this curiosity. What does law do in this context, and what does different types of law do, and how does it interact with power, and how do different groups change how does it change the conditions of various groups? And in particular, there are indigenous populations because they're protected in different ways in different parts of the states. They have a different constitutional protection, and they all seem to want what the others have, and then without really knowing what that entails. So I think this is a collaboration that's funded by the Norwegian Research Council and a special grant that is for collaboration between India and Norway. So the partners is the CMI and the Center for Social Transformation in Bergen, and the most important partner in the project is the Center for Policy Studies in Delhi, where you have a relatively large team led by Namita, and they have created a special initiative, the Land Rights Initiative, around this project and other projects that are coming in, led by Namita. So CMI is a small partner in this, but we are, in addition to myself, Hugo Stocker is unfortunately at hospital, which is why he hasn't been participating this week. He's the sort of partner on this side, and then also, and most importantly from the Norwegian side, who is here, fortunately, Kavita, who is a postdoc, or has been a postdoc, is now on maternity leave, but has gracefully come to participate. So Kavita and Namita are both they're the ones who have they carry the large research burden, and they have vast knowledge in the field. Namita is with a new law PhD from Harvard on these issues. Kavita with a political science PhD from Delhi with a focus on federal relations. So we have and then quite a large team now, including Palan, who's been with us from the beginning, more or less, of the project, who's been also at Harvard for a year, but is now back in India, and also so this is from a relatively small grant. It's actually quite a large project, and I think it's a project that really has made it's made a difference in terms of creating interaction between other groups working in this field as well, in Delhi and beyond. I mean, we've had amazing workshops where people have been coming from different parts of the country, both from the research side and from the policy side. So I think Namita has been doing a wonderful job at creating that in India. And she will start out with her presentation, and then Kavita will follow on and her at the end. And then Jackie will start off the discussion. And I think my task as a chair will be very easy. But if somebody just keeps talking, I will stop. I'll stop it. I want to stand, yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Siri, for being such a wonderful mentor, collaborator, host, and for this wonderful Bergen Exchanges, the opportunity to get to know all of you and learn about your work. I'm very happy to share the work that we are doing at the Land Rights Initiative at CPR. The initiative is CPR's, the Center for Policy Research's newest initiative. It's less than a year old. We actually launched it last November. And the goal behind the initiative is really to investigate questions pertaining to the state's relationship to land in India and how the state has in the past and continues today to redistribute property rights of different groups of people. So it grew out of my doctoral work at Harvard and this project, but we are hoping to expand our work beyond these areas of work. So in this project, we are investigating the property rights of tribals, both individual and community rights. Tribals in India are constitutionally described as the scheduled tribes, to land and natural resources within the scheduled areas, and I will explain what these are, by examining the background legal rules and assumptions behind the rules that structure these rights. A related goal is to see how these legal regimes interact with the vast administrative and bureaucratic apparatus of the Indian state, and to see how this in turn shapes the opportunity structure of central development actors, policymakers, civil society and community groups, private investors, etc., and how this influences their decisions and what are the effects of those decisions. Now, the larger goal behind this study is really to understand the reasons for poverty, landlessness and displacement of the scheduled tribes, who are one of the most vulnerable groups in India. And I will speak a little bit later about the paradox of the protective framework of tribal communities. And the reason why we're looking into this from land is because that's partly where my expertise lies, but also because I think land, especially forest land, is central to tribal identity, representation and development. The scheduled tribes have been engaged in a variety of traditional occupations where they have lived off the land, whether it is hunting-gathering in the past, collecting minor forest produce, shifting cultivation, and increasingly now settled cultivation. Land for them, therefore, is integral to their cultural, social and political life, their very identity. Displacement from the land makes them not only economically vulnerable, it threatens to destroy their cultural identity as a tribal group. So let me begin by outlining the constitutional framework that governs the scheduled tribes in India. The scheduled areas are areas designated in Article 244(1) of the Indian Constitution, read with the 5th and 6th schedules, which is why they are called the scheduled areas. These areas are subject to a different legal and administrative regime as compared to the rest of the country. The scheduled tribes are designated in the Constitution Scheduled Tribes Order of 1950, and this order actually lists 744 tribes across 22 states in the 5th schedule. Sorry, this clicker is going faster than I am. So, and states have added and deleted to this tribes from this list over the period of the last 65 years. The 5th schedule provides for the administration of tribal majority areas in 10 states within peninsular India that have tribal minority populations. That is, the population of the scheduled tribes is in a minority compared to that of the remainder of the state. The President of India can, by order, declare any area to be a scheduled area.
The currently designated scheduled areas are in these states. The ones highlighted are states that we are studying as part of this project. Here you see them on the map. All the yellow area are states which have areas which are scheduled under the 5th schedule. And I'll speak in a little bit about the 6th schedule, the red area of states which come under the 6th schedule in the Northeast. Now, according to the 5th schedule, these areas are to be administered by the governor of the state in consultation with the tribe's advisory councils to be appointed by the governor. The governor has powers to regulate the application of state laws and parliamentary laws to the scheduled areas and can make special regulations for good governance in the state. Now, India is often described as a union of states. What that means is that we have a federal system with a unitary bias. We have a parliamentary system of government where the president and the governors make their decisions mostly on the basis of recommendations of the Council of Ministers. The implication of these facts for the way the scheduled areas are governed is that there is considerable centralization of power. What this also means is that legally speaking, there is no recognition of tribal sovereignty over the land and natural resources in the scheduled areas. It is the Indian state that has sovereignty over these areas. There is only recognition of the special status of tribals and state-directed laws for their protection. Despite the governor's extensive powers in these areas, over the last 65 years they have been rarely exercised. However, with the enactment of the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of 1996, there has been some more devolution of political power to the village panchayats in the scheduled areas. All of these states have also enacted laws that prohibit the transfer of land within the scheduled areas to non-tribals. The 6th schedule provides the broad framework for the administration of tribal areas in the northeastern states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. And here we are looking at Meghalaya, and Kavita is going to speak about the system of administration there. But the 6th scheduled areas also have land transfer prohibition laws. So going back again to our map, these are the 6 scheduled states. And this is the state of Meghalaya. All of the state of Meghalaya comes under the 6th schedule. So if you recall from what I said earlier, the tribal populations are spread over 22 states. And yet, if you see from the map, the designated scheduled areas are only in 16 states. So we know already that there are many states with tribal populations that do not have designated scheduled areas for the same. And even within the states that have scheduled areas, significant tribal populations are to be found in areas that are not scheduled areas. And there is considerable variation both in terms of the percentages of tribal population with respect to the total population of the tribal minority states in the scheduled areas, as well as the percentages of tribal population within the scheduled areas. So if you look at this map, which shows the percentage of scheduled tribe population to total population, the dark green is above 40%, so that is mostly concentrated in the northeast. For instance, the state of Meghalaya, 85.9% of the population is actually tribal in nature. And it is much lesser, so 5 and below are the red, and so these states have lesser percentages of tribal population, so they don't really have scheduled areas. So why are we studying this project? Why is this project important? It's because scheduled tribes are some of the most vulnerable groups in India who, based on statistical data, have disproportionately borne the burden of economic development. Poverty and landlessness is rampant amongst the scheduled tribes. More than half of all the scheduled tribes are below the poverty line, and 65% of scheduled tribes are landless as per the 2011 census. This number is not only high compared to the national average of 40.2%, but it has also gone up in the last 2 decades. So, even though the scheduled tribes constitute only 8.6% of the total population, they constitute 55% of the people who have been displaced since independence as a result of various state activities including dams, infrastructure development, mining, industrial development, and the creation of wildlife parks and sanctuaries. These challenges of displacement and deprivation have also intensified in the last 2 decades as the post-1991 liberalization period and economic reforms have created ever greater opportunities for industrial and infrastructure development through domestic and foreign capital inflows. The need for land, mineral, and other natural resources for these projects has caused massive displacement of tribals and other traditional communities, and serious environmental damage, including depletion of forest cover, soil erosion, and environmental pollution. So going back to our original question, we saw that the Constitution provides a pretty extensive protective legal framework for protecting the property rights of the scheduled tribes to land and natural resources, and yet, as I just told you, we have a dismal situation in terms of landlessness and deprivation. So why is that the case? The states that we have selected are 4 Indian states: Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Gujarat, and Meghalaya. And these have been chosen based on geographical, political, population, and constitutional diversity. Such is the dynamism of the Indian political environment that at the time we got the grant for this project in 2013, we planned to study 3 states, because actually Andhra Pradesh was 1 state. But since then, in 2014, Andhra Pradesh was bifurcated into 2 states, the states of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So you see here, that's AP and that's Telangana, and these are the 4 states that we are studying. All 4 states show variation with regard to the numbers and concentration of tribal population, socio-political differences, and current and historical federal dynamics. So far at CPR, we have done substantial archival research on Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and 2 rounds of key informant interviews with activists, academics, government, lawyers, and judges. In Gujarat, we are trying to complete our archival research and have completed 1 round of key informant interviews, but only with activists and lawyers. So to give you some context on the 2 states and then go on to our preliminary findings on what we have learned, Gujarat is a state in the western part of the country, you already see that, with one of the highest rates of economic growth, and it is ruled by the BJP, which is, at the time we started the project, was the party in opposition at the center, it's now the party in government. A 2014 study ranked Gujarat at the top amongst 20 large Indian states in terms of economic freedom, an index that measures the ease of doing business by studying governance, labor, and business regulation. And the GDP growth rates in Gujarat are amongst the highest in India. They've averaged at 12% over the last 7 years. On human development indicators, however, Gujarat is ranked 11 out of 25 states, according to the 2011 report. And scheduled tribes constitute almost 15% of the population. And this population is concentrated along the eastern side of the state. All these, the red dots represent the scheduled areas in the state of Gujarat. Andhra Pradesh and Telangana are bordering states in the southeastern part of the country. So let me go back to the map, you see them. Historically, the state of Telangana was a princely state under the Nizam of Hyderabad, whereas the part which is now Andhra Pradesh, which is the red part, was part of the Madras Presidency under the British. When India became independent in 1947, we had the parts of British India that became independent. There were also 526 princely states. So in 1948, the Madras Presidency, which extended almost all of South India, was, Andhra Pradesh was broken from that and created a separate state. And 5 years later, in 1953, Hyderabad was merged into Andhra Pradesh. So in 1953, this was created, and now more than 50 years later, 60 years later, they have now come apart again. So a lot of the data obviously that we have is for the combined state of AP, but in the 2014 study, AP was ranked 3 in terms of economic freedom. Its GDP growth rate has averaged about 10%, and in terms of HDI indicators, it is ranked 15th amongst 25 states. So in that sense, Gujarat and AP and Telangana are similar because they have both high economic growth rates but have middling performance of HDI indicators. Where they are dissimilar, however, is in terms of the percentage of tribal population. The tribal population in Andhra is only about half of that of Gujarat, 7%. And now that we have figures for the separation, it's 5.3 in AP, 9.8 in Telangana. So that makes the analysis more complicated as well. So now, based on all the work we've done, I would like to make 6 main points in terms of our preliminary conclusions about how we should understand the questions of displacement and deprivation of tribals in the states of Gujarat, AP, and Telangana. These are the the scheduled areas in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. I believe that many of these points will also apply to a greater or lesser extent to the other 5th scheduled states and also to the 6th scheduled states, including Meghalaya, which we are not studying at CPR as part of this project grant, but could study in case the Research Council would give us more funding. The The first point comes out of my doctoral work, which traces the law of eminent domain in India from the colonial period until 1970 and examines how state institutions in India, first the British colonial state, but after independence, the independent Indian state, and within that, the three separate institutions, the parliament, the executive and the judiciary, how they have reshaped property relations in India. Now, of course, the motivations of the colonial Indian state and the independent Indian state were quite different. The colonial state's stated motivation was to maximize revenue for the British Crown. The Indian state's stated motivation was to redistribute property relations so as to bring about economic development and social redistribution. But significant legal and institutional continuities between the British colonial state and the independent Indian state have meant that despite different motivations, the consequences of their policies for the interests of the tribals and other traditional communities have been often quite similar. Thus, the first point is that the special protective provisions contained in the 5th and 6th schedules cannot be seen in a vacuum, and in order to find the answers to why they may or may not have worked or why implementation has been inadequate, we have to look at the state's active role through law and through policy and action to displace tribals from their lands by looking at various laws of land acquisition for building dams, infrastructure, protecting forest land and mining, which form a contrary legal regime to the protective framework of the 5th and 6th schedules. But at the same time, both the enactment and administration of this contrary regime in turn depends upon the broader political economy of these states. For instance, the construction of dams is obviously a significant cause of displacement of tribal population in all of India. If you look at this map about the concentration of dams in India, we see, so the white dots are the scheduled areas in the states of Gujarat, Telangana, Andhra and also in Meghalaya. And the coloring shows the number of dams, and unfortunately you can't see everything, but the purple shade is the maximum number of dams, which is between 78 to 99. And the orange, which is here in Andhra and Telangana, the number of dams is 34 to 45. So what we find here is that there are between 35 to 45 dams in many of the scheduled areas of Andhra Pradesh. It is less so in Meghalaya, but if you look at the purple color, which is there in many of the scheduled areas in Gujarat, that's almost like 100 dams. And if you look at the major dams in Gujarat, we find that they are entirely concentrated along this eastern belt where all the scheduled areas are. So look at this map and look at the map of the scheduled areas. So we know that they are concentrated. And in fact, all three dams of national importance in Gujarat, dams of national importance are those which are responsible for providing water and electricity to many states. So they're really big dams. All of them are in the scheduled areas in Gujarat. So we know that displacement because of dams is bound to be a much more serious issue there than in AP and Telangana. The second point that I would like to make is that when we think of the Constituent Assembly debates on the scheduled tribes in 5th schedules, we think of them in terms of three intersecting narratives of development, representation and rights to land. The first narrative, that of development, is that the special status of the scheduled tribes is because their economic, political and social way of life is considered not as developed as the rest of the population, and therefore they are particularly vulnerable groups of people. This is different from how other vulnerable groups are seen within the constitutional framework. For instance, the scheduled castes, another vulnerable group, their special status is because of a narrative of systematic discrimination against them within the mainstream of Hindu society. So the scheduled castes are part of the mainstream, but the scheduled tribes have always been out of the Indian society and do not want to be a part of that, right? The second narrative is that of representation. That is, the scheduled tribes are represented through a group identity within the constitutional framework, which is different from that of the rest of the population. They are represented as a group within the tribes' advisory councils as part of the federal structure. And there, of course, they are different from the rest of the population, Pallav and me, Kavita, who have individual representation. The third narrative, of course, is their relationship to land. They have both individual and community rights with respect to the land. Most of the rest of the population doesn't. So, for instance, I can only claim right as an individual, not as a community. But unlike, say, me or Pallav, who can buy a plot of land in Delhi, though probably not afford it, the scheduled tribes, they don't have recognized rights to particular pieces of land within, they do and they don't. So for instance, they can alienate land amongst themselves, but if the government came and decided to displace them from the land, because there is no value to the land, it is not available in the open market as such, they may not be compensated for it in the same way that, I would if my land is taken away in Delhi. This has changed a little bit after the enactment of the Forest Rights Act of 2006, and I'll speak about it a little bit later. But that's the situation as it is. So the second point I want to make is that when we think about the efficacy of protective provisions, we have to see that in terms of all these three narratives, they are pitted against the dominant mainstream narrative. And that is one reason why some scholars have suggested that the scheduled castes, even though they continue to be marginalized and disadvantaged, have come out much better than the scheduled tribes because they are within the mainstream of Indian society. The third point that comes out of the Constituent Assembly debates and has also been confirmed in our fieldwork is that there is considerable variation amongst tribal groups, both between different states in peninsular India but also within the states. For instance, in Andhra Pradesh, and I'm speaking of combined Andhra Pradesh because a lot of the data is about that, there are 33 recognized tribal groups, of which only 8 are particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And on each of these narratives, whether it's development, ability to be represented, as well as rights to land, some groups are more dominant than others and have cornered most of the benefits available to the scheduled tribes. For instance, there is a group called the Lambadas in Andhra Pradesh, and all the other tribal groups hate them. In fact, there was a training session for tribal lawyers and they would not even sit at the same table, is because they have cornered a large share of the benefits in the scheduled areas of Adilabad, one of the tribal districts. Similarly, in Gujarat, there are 29 notified scheduled tribes, but 47% of the tribal population, that is almost half, is just one tribal group, the Bhils. The fourth point that comes out is that there wasn't enough systematic work done on the classification of the scheduled tribes and sub-classifications within them, both at the time of drafting and subsequently. So there are problems of over-inclusion and under-inclusion. Again, the example of the Lambadas, they are recognized as a scheduled tribe in AP, but they are not recognized as a scheduled tribe in the bordering state of Maharashtra. So what that has meant is that there has been significant migration of the Lambadas from Maharashtra to AP, and that itself is a source of disharmony within that state. The fifth point that comes out is that we see variations in terms of, and this comes out of both our archival research as well as the fieldwork, is that we see variations in terms of both the implementation of the fifth schedule as well as the normative legal framework that the states have created at the state level, which supports the protective provisions contained in the schedule. And based on our preliminary investigation, we find that the combined state of AP has done much better than Gujarat. Now, the tribal population of Andhra, as you remember, is half of that of Gujarat. So the question that then arises is, has AP done better in Gujarat in spite of, or because it has a statistically less significant tribal population? In other words, is it easier to implement protective provisions when the group that is special is statistically smaller or insignificant to the mainstream? The last and final point I will make here is regarding the institutional apparatus for the implementation of the provisions of the fifth schedule, changes in which could make a significant difference to the efficacy of the fifth schedule without the need for amending the constitution, because the constant preoccupation of many academics and experts working on this issue is, oh, we need to amend the constitution, we need to make the fifth schedule area subject to the sixth schedule, and that would be a lot better. So legal change can bring about difference on the ground, and I believe A, that amending the constitution is really difficult, and B, if changing things in the constitution is what made the difference, then we would not be in this situation we are in today. So Pallav will speak about financial allocations to the Tribal Welfare Department, which is the government department chiefly responsible for the welfare of the scheduled tribes. So I'll leave him to do that. But I will speak about the Forest Department, which is a major player in the scheduled areas. The Forest Department, both at the state and federal level, comes under the Ministry of Environment and Forests, which was only created in the 1980s. But its functions are effectively done by the Indian Forest Service, which was created in 1966. Through a series of colonial legislation starting in the 19th century, at the federal level and also at the states, the British government declared large tracts of forest land, large tracts of land with forest cover as land that was to be owned and managed by the Forest Department. Now, the definition of forest in the laws is basically any land with trees on it that the government declares as forest land. As a result, in one sweep of the pen, the state outlawed the rights of the forest-dwelling tribals by declaring that this was land, protected forest land, and nobody had the business to be there except the forest department. Consequently, even today, a lot of the land in the scheduled areas, but also outside it, is managed by the forest department. Now, in 2006, the Indian Parliament enacted the Forest Rights Act, which sought to reverse this historic injustice and recognize the rights of tribals to the land. The Tribal Welfare Department is the nodal agency for the implementation of the Forest Rights Act. But they have to work with the Forest Department to implement this law. And that department has been hostile and uncooperative, both with respect to the tribal communities, but also, and this is based on our fieldwork in the state of AP, coordination has been difficult between the Tribal Welfare and Forest Department. Remember, these are vast tracts of land which come under the administration of the Forest Department. It's very difficult. The Forest Department is the only department which has had the resources, the knowledge, the history of managing. If they don't cooperate, not much can be done. But again, the extent to which this is a problem is different for each state. For instance, in Telangana, more than 77% of the forest land is in the scheduled areas. In the new state of AP, it is only 37%. In Gujarat, it is almost 50%. So it's an issue in all of the states, but again, there will be variations on how much this is an issue. And I will conclude with this, that in terms of the changes that we propose based on the work, we have to look both at the potential and limits of social change through law based on the vast administrative bureaucratic apparatus of the state and see how they relate to each other and either help or impede in bringing about this change. So I will end with that, and except to say that if you're interested in following our work, this is our website and other presence. Thank you. Which one? India.
So I have a very competent colleague here who has a map already. So I could produce a number of slides at her cost.
Do you want
the India map? I just want to show this one.
Oh.
I'll just quickly point out. There is this tiny state, which is Meghalaya, and this region, entire region, is in the eastern Himalayas. So this has a very special topography, geography, and the people here are actually connected with the mainland India through a narrow corridor to Assam. And as you can see, that this big chunk here is Bangladesh. So they are like cut off from the peninsular India in geographical sense. And they have a narrow corridor which is known as Chicken's Neck, through which they are connected to the mainland India. And also this northeast region as a whole is very significant from a strategic point of view. Because if we think of 1947, when India got its independence, at the same time Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan. So it had very significant territorial and strategic reason that it was divided in this way, and it also shares its borders with Burma, Myanmar, and China. So I'm going to talk about this little tiny state of Meghalaya, but if I have time, I would also like to speak a little bit about the region as a whole, and also about this state here, which is known as Arunachal Pradesh. And it is very significant, I thought, because with the connecting session on water and rights of indigenous people towards their natural resources, Arunachal is also facing some very specific problems. And just see that it shares almost its entire border with China. So these are the two states, but I would specifically be speaking about Meghalaya. Yeah.
We've upgraded from the computer last night, so now it's Namita's computer, so I think we're all grateful.
Right. So this is basically showing the title, and yeah, I'm going to talk about land and dispossession in Meghalaya. And Meghalaya or a lot of other states in the northeast are of special significance because they are under the 6th schedule. As you can all recall, that Namita has spoken about the 5th schedule, and then these states are under a special constitutional provision of the 6th schedule under the Indian Constitution. And yeah. So basically, what is 6th schedule is, it is a special provision under the Indian Constitution which gives protective rights to the indigenous communities to have control over their natural resources, land, water, forests. And I will tell you why it was interesting for me to start with Meghalaya, because in my naivety, or maybe it's popularly opined that communities, when given rights to control their own land or natural resources, would act as a better deterrent against land alienation or displacement. And so that was the idea I went with. And in order to, this idea was institutionalized in the Indian Constitution under the 6th schedule. And very briefly, what is 6th schedule? It is about the creation of these, second point, the statutory bodies which are known as autonomous district councils. These are based on principles of, they are democratic bodies, and they are supposed to help control, regulate communities' ownership over their natural resources and many other things, but since I'm concerned only with land, I'm going to talk about land rights, so that's the main focus here. And basically, in Meghalaya, the creation of these ADCs, which the Autonomous District Councils, I would from now on call them as ADCs, they meant that there exist parallel bodies of land governance in Meghalaya. That is, the ADCs, there are state bodies, that is the provincial state bodies, and then there are federal bodies like the Forest Department, for instance. And because it's a 6th schedule, they also have customary tribal traditional bodies who are in control and manage. Actually, at ground level, they are the ones who really matter. Because, why? Because the land system itself in Meghalaya is very special. So basically, before I come to the point that what is the land system, just a little bit on that. For me, as a researcher, it was interesting to study these parallel systems of land management and the interface between them, right? There is a modern law institutions, and then there are customary law institutions, and how they're managing land, and how are the interests of the people and communities expressed through them, how has it shaped the entire narrative in the state of Meghalaya. So in the 6th schedule state, the land management in Meghalaya is very special because first of all it's radically different. And why it is radically different? Because as we've spoken that it's a 6th schedule state. And what it basically means is that whilst in rest of the Indian states, land, forests belong to the state of India, but in Meghalaya they belong to the people, and those people could be individuals, which would be then similar for everybody as in the rest of India, but more significantly they could be clan lands, they could be communal lands, and it belongs to the people. So the state does not, it can acquire property, but it would have to undergo, under the lens of the 6th schedule. So it's like, it has a lot of nitty-gritties which interest the lawyers a lot, but I'm a political scientist. But it has engaged me very deeply. So basically it means that land cannot be transferred from a tribal to a non-tribal, right? So I think therein lies the entire key, because I mean, in a general political narrative, one would think, oh, well, that's good. So it cannot be transferred, so it belongs to the people. But yeah, but yeah, what happens? And as I said, that I went in with rather some degree of naivety because my PhD was not about this at all, and I believe that it would show something else, but it did not show what I expected. So basically, there is this intrinsic acceptance of customary practices regarding land regulation, control, and management. And yet there is widespread variation within the state, and the variation can be so much that when for the first time I landed in Shillong, which is the capital of Meghalaya, we had a big roundtable conference in the university there about the project, and I was introducing the project, and they were all academicians sitting around the round table. And they would not agree with one another about, no, but in my village it's not like that, and in that village it's like that. So it really varies, but as a whole, it is under the 6th schedule with all its nitty-gritties. And there exists no cadastral surveys, there are no land records which exist at a wider scale, and the customary laws are not codified. So it means a lot of scope for interpretations and variations, and as we'll see, it has produced a whole lot of dynamics also. So what are the primary pointers from the case studies of the Khasi Hills? So Meghalaya is a big state, and not so big as Andhra or Gujarat, but nevertheless for one person it was a big state. So I chose one of the districts in Meghalaya for my case study, which is known as the Khasi Hills. There are three major tribes in Meghalaya: Khasis, Jayantiyas, and Garos. And if some of you are more aware of the geography of Himalayas, they are also known by the hills. They are the Khasi, Garo, and Jayantiya hills. And it's because they have been named, or the tribes have been named because of those hills from which they come from. So what were the primary pointers for me from the Khasi Hills? As I said, that I wanted to study this interface between the modern and the customary legal bodies or traditional bodies controlling and regulating land in Meghalaya. So of course it's under the 6th schedule, and it was not difficult to get an impression once I started talking to people or reading, basically, that the 6th schedule in itself, through its has created an opportunity structure of its own, and the rich or the powerful or the influential within the clans or within the tribal hierarchies could actually usurp the powers from that opportunity structure, and hence given rise to a new modern idea and a new tribal elite in a way, which is significantly different from the traditional tribal elite, and isn't tribal at all, because they have a lot of social mobility as well. That is not my primary query, but there are a lot of parallel narratives, when once you are in the field, you come to know of so many things, and they all have an effect on the land issue. Why? Because land traditionally as well has had a significant meaning for the people from the region, because it gives them their clan identity. It means that you come from that village, and it gives you an identity of your own. So basically, this tribal land management and control, which I spoke of, this modern and customary, they exist parallel, has given rise to what seems like a web of parallel overlapping jurisdictions. So there is a state revenue office, there is where you can register your land, and there is a tribal's head's office where you can register your land, and then there is at a village level a tribal council body which knows that you own that piece of land, so on and so forth. And this, because of this web, there is a great amount of confusion, especially when conflicts arise. And conflicts arise because of
development interventions either by the state, but largely by the state because there's not so much private capital in the state of Meghalaya, although there is beginning to be. So it has had these very specific implications for the tribal concept of land itself. From what I said, that it used to be like a clan identity, it has helped to reinforce the monetary value of land for tribal people, which has thus in some ways meant that more and more people have tried to individualize their communal land. So if there was communal land, through various methods which we can talk about later, people have transferred the rights into individual names. So and there are like different forces which have helped this individualization of land or monetization of land. And thus, this has also meant that basically large chunks of communal land in especially the commercially viable regions of Meghalaya, the state of Meghalaya, have lost, they are individualized basically. And when it comes to courts and laws, and when it comes into the domain of modern law, when you need to register because of a development initiative, the land is being acquired, and it's at that time that the most poor and the vulnerable have suddenly, to their surprise, found out that this is no more their land. They had their usage and occupancy rights, but it was communal land. But in reality, the powerful and the influential who knew that, okay, some development is being planned by the state or the federal government in that region, they often enliven with the tribal heads, the chiefs, because they are also the influential families, the powerful families and the educated families who have access to such information. They have individualized that land. So it has basically meant erosion of this communal land, erosion of that safety net which comes from the very idea of communal land, that the deprived or the destitute families can get land to subsist basically. So there is this nice quote which I found from the ASI, is the Anthropological Survey of India in 2013. There is an edited book which they have released, and I think this quote sums it up very well, that earlier clan divisions were the chief indicators of social differentiation, but now movement from kin-based hierarchy, there is a movement from kin-based hierarchy to economic inequality, and this is something very significant from the point of view of tribal egalitarian values, on which gave the faith in the Indian Constitution to give those special privileges under the 6th schedule, that communal land is best left to communities to handle, and it would be the best safeguard against displacement. So, and of course there are these ADCs, which are these statutory bodies, which is a modern democratic body, which was supposed to regulate and control all these things of land management, and was supposed to avoid such misuse of power, but it has either not been able to create or legislate because of the entire dynamic of state and federal forces. The governor would just sit on a law, on a legislation, and would not give assent. So basically, it does not come into. Yeah. So now I have only 5 minutes and lots of slides to go with. So basically, such control mechanisms have been ineffective, and this has also meant an erosion of women's rights to over land. What does it mean? So I would quickly like to go through this. Meghalaya is also very special because all the Garo, Khasi and Jaintia tribes, they practice matrilineal, and that means that the youngest daughter is the inheritor and custodian and the administrator of ancestral land, and they claim their lineage through their maternal clans. But there has to be a nuanced understanding to this, because the youngest daughter, who who is not the owner of the land, but she is the custodian of the land. So that means it brings in a lot of responsibility. You have to take care of your extended family, you have to be like a guardian to them, and it also means lack of mobility for that youngest daughter. And is she really the decision maker? Well, that is under question, because mostly it's the maternal uncles, the male members on the maternal side, who take decisions regarding selling or mortgaging. And also there is conspicuous, women are conspicuously absent from traditional tribal socio-political bodies. They are not represented. So they have economic rights in that sense that she inherits the property, but she's not, and none of the female members are part of those tribal bodies, which are eventually the decision makers. So when when the state comes with the idea of land acquisition, so there are none of the female members sitting in those council bodies to decide. So they are not decision makers in that sense. And even in modern institutions following their culture, therefore there is passivity of women's participation. And this of course leads to the changing circumstances because of mortgaging or selling and individualization of land. So women, it kind of has eroded women's special privileges over land. Similar is with forests as well. Yeah. So traditionally women have had a non-invasive engagement with forests. They were picking for example, mushrooms for edible reasons or medicinal or herbal produce, but and they've also been known to be better conservators of biodiversity in the region. But with commodification of forests and timber trade, and even with shadow practices related with timber trade, because timber trade is banned in Meghalaya through it has basically, but it continues illegally. So it basically has meant that women have been pushed out of the forest as well, and there is little policy focus so far on it. Do I have time to speak about it? So then I would talk very quickly about my specific case study, which was on land. It was not, I was not looking on women's issues, but it is an strong undercurrent. So my case study was regarding this new Shillong Township, NST, which was a satellite town around Shillong, which was again a state-led development initiative, and the state government of Meghalaya was supposed to acquire land for this. And it was the acquisition of the communal land, again, which gave rise to disputed claims and land titles. As I said, that mostly communities were unaware that the land has been individualized, but when the acquisition process was set in motion, then a lot of disputes came up, and this was largely intra-community conflicts over proprietorships. So it shows various anomalies in land management and control processes, and I have made this distinction between customary and modern. So let me just quickly read through it. What happened was that whenever a land acquisition process is set in motion, a cadastral survey is supposed to be carried out before an intent notice can go in the newspaper. And the communities in Meghalaya in general do not have faith in state-run cadastral surveys. It is believed that it is an impingement of their intrinsic right to control and manage their own land, and it would mean that the next step would be that the state would ask for revenue and go in for acquisition of land. So I think this is a lacuna which is existing, why there is a lack of faith, and there are like different other reasons, but I'm just running through them. And as I said, that the communal land has been individualized, so this shows that there has been a manipulation from the educated and powerful, often in unison with the tribal heads, and the communities have been in dark about it. And this also shows that there is a dilution of the tribal justice system in these communities. It shows clear favoritism, and it has popped up various contending claims to land ownership between the different tribal hierarchies as well. And because of this, there is a lot of debate going on, and a lot of NGOs and media debates, and talking about this, and of course the judicial cases. At the modern institutional level, my case studies, which I have not discussed, but this is what the primary pointers were, or the inferences for me, that the local administration failed to garner support or cooperation from people on the ground. There is a high-handed approach in land acquisition process itself, and this land acquisition was according to the older law of 1894. And the state administration relies more upon the opportunities to object, which is like through judicial justice mechanisms. But then it again means that, like the Khadrov has said, that it leads to dispersal of politics into law, and there is a judicial fetishism that there is almost that judiciary has magical powers to, solve problems, and it leads to judicial overload, delays, and it's of course expensive. And we are talking about some of the most poor and vulnerable, destitute group of people. And this is also a judicial challenge in a way, especially in these areas, because such controversial interventions for development's sake, when they are done, they tend to reconfigure the alliances on the ground. So they shape up new conflicts, they shape up new alliances, and then it is very difficult even for judiciary to locate that what is the real local, who are the real stakeholders. So I think that is the big challenge with the Indian judicial system there. Some of the malevolent effects of this are, of course, like we discussed, individualization of communal land, and this is not something new that I'm saying. It was warned against in as early as 1974 by the first Land Reform Commission for the state. There is intra-communal displacement and pauperization, and there is a severe erosion of tribal values. So this safety net, which I spoke of, has big holes, and people have kind of fallen in between. So there is this model institutions to protect under the 6th schedule, and then there are tribal institutions which have communal land, and these were supposed to be safety net, but people seem to have fallen in between these two, and they are the most vulnerable. And because people cannot establish ownership, so the just and the due compensation which is supposed to come out of land acquisition process is also denied to such groups. So what are my inferences? I wouldn't say that they are conclusions, because it's an ongoing process, and it's like ever changing. People are going to the courts, and people are also trying to settle it within themselves through their tribal judicial mechanisms. But there are some major inferences nonetheless which have come out. So it feels that it is unfair to singularly hold federal interpretations and legislations responsible for diluting a system that protects the commons. The case studies have pointed to alienation stemming from development initiatives of the state, but it also highlights a parallel paradox of intra-community land alienation. The communities seem to be divided in their collective imagination as to what is their idea of development for the region. So there is, on one hand, there is a landed elite, and there is also beginning to be absentee landlordism, which was unknown in these regions, because these are people who do not depend on land for subsistence. They have white-collar jobs or businesses. So this landed elite or this absentee landlordism, they are more interested, or seem to be more interested, in adopting a modern market understanding of land, and therefore choosing that particular model of development. And the poor are, it seems from my case study at least, that they are too vulnerable to establish even their ownership rights, or to assert their rights, or to even make a choice if they want to sell or not, because the land does not belong to them in that way. And the civil activists and the politicians also seem to be stuck in a limbo over it. There is a lot of contra statements through them, and this has intensified the role of courts, and the legal interpretations are thus critical in shaping the community's future posturing vis-a-vis the state-led development initiatives. And this has meant that the Khasi's idea of land requires a relook, and therefore it also requires a review of the 6th schedule itself, which has institutionalized this idea, or tried to institutionalize. I think I'll just stop here then, because I'm over time. Yeah. Thank you.
That's wonderful. And now we'll have even a third presentation by Hannah.
morning, everyone. So I'll be very brief, and this is basically the work that we've done in relation to the project. We are looking at the Ministry of Tribal Welfare. It's a federal government ministry, and it looks after the interests of the tribal population in India. When I look at how the other countries manage indigenous tribes and indigenous groups, the first example I have in front of me is the United States. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was established in 1824 and has been managing the affairs of the indigenous tribes in America for almost 200 years now. When I look at Brazil, the FUNAI, which is the National Indian Foundation, has been in existence since 1964 and has been working for the development of tribal population in Brazil. Both of them work for Indian people, and then we had a ministry in India finally in 1999. It's a federal government ministry. That doesn't mean that the states do not have the autonomy to have their own ministries and own departments for tribal welfare. But in 1999, the government of India decided that they need a ministry exclusively for tribal welfare. The government uses the ministry basically to fund both central as well as state projects. The states which have tribal population need funding from the federal government, as well as there are certain federal schemes such as education, such as forests and their management where tribal people live, that they need to have their own central schemes which are funded through the central government. So I'm looking specifically at how the federal government manages finances and exercises control over the states as well as its own departments when it comes to tribal welfare. India is largely a planned economy. India is a planned economy. The finances of India are planned on a 5-year scale, on a period of every 5 years. This is done by two commissions called the Finance Commission and the Planning Commission. The federal government, which came to power in 2014, has scrapped the Planning Commission. It is no longer in existence, but for the last almost 60 years, the Planning Commission is in charge, along with the Finance Commission, to decide how much money will be spent in the economy in what manner, specifically for the federal government. Now, Article 275 provides that the federal government, which collects most of the taxes, will channelize funds back to the states in a certain way which is provided by the Constitution, specifically for tribal development. So the Constitution provides that the central government will channelize funds on the recommendation of the Planning and the Finance Commission to the various states for various activities of tribal development. The money comes from a fund called the Consolidated Fund of India, which is basically where all the taxes go together, and this money is then utilized on the recommendations to various states which have tribal population. Until 1999, there was a consolidated ministry called Social Justice and Empowerment, which used to govern a lot of areas, including a lot of marginalized people together. But in 1999, the government decided that they need a dedicated ministry for tribal affairs, which is called the Ministry of Tribal Affairs now. And this is now the nodal ministry and does all work with regard to short and long-term planning for tribal development. And it has a range of functions. On their website, they speak about education, income generation, health, irrigation, roads, bridges, forests, food processing, human resource development, water harvesting, resettlement of displaced people, land management, everything. So we basically understand that the ambition of the ministry is to run a parallel economy. They want to do everything that a regular government does for regular people. And the ministry itself does nothing. It simply has the resources, and it's like I'll show you over here. It has allocated resources, and then it allocates the resources to different ministries, both in the federal government and to the states. The data which is available to us and which we've been studying starts from 2008-2009. Then the ministry had, this is all in rupees and a certain value that we put to the currency called crores, but just as in absolute terms, It was 416 in 2008-2009, and it's roughly about 13-17 right now. We see a double increment in 2009-2010, and then there has been, it's almost thrice of what the original allocation for the ministry was. And there has been a successive increase in the amount of money that they've been releasing out to the states and to other federal arms. So what we see that there is a substantial jump in the absolute value of money which is coming to the ministry and the absolute value of what is being released by the ministry for tribal development. But a major criticism is that, look at the second point, which is an old figure. The tribal population in India is roughly about 8.6% of the total population, which is about 1.3 billion at the moment. And so about 84 million in 2001, which is probably now gone up substantially. And the budgetary allocation, which is this, forms only 0.2% of the union budget every year. So for almost about 9% of the people, you only spend 0.2% of your yearly income towards their development, and especially when you want to do all of this. You want to build roads, bridges, water harvesting, basically everything under the sun, like a parallel sort of an economy, through really, really poor resources that you're allocating for tribal development. What we aim to see, this is just a glimpse of how the ministry works, how the federal government sort of exercises control over state entities, over its own various federal functionaries like the forest department, the health department, the education department, specifically for the purpose of tribal welfare. It will be interesting to see how the United States does it through the Indian Affairs Bureau. And someone told me over the conference this week that FUNAI is a really good example to look at in Brazil, which is the National Indian Foundation. These are both agencies who've been working for a very long time. They're doing very similar work, and they're both at the federal level. So, I think going forward, it's interesting to see how you compare these these three agencies, because this is relatively new, and this is still in a formulative stage. I'm sorry, but that's the ambition of this sub project that I'm looking at the moment.
Thank you so much, Pallav and Kavita and Amita. You've given us really a very good sort of glimpse into the work that you're doing on the project. And I'll just give the word to Jackie to start off.
Thanks very much. I don't know that much about India, so my questions are probably way too superficial, but let's see how it goes. What is my stance? My stance is that I am a scholar and activist on courts and the law and on socioeconomic rights who was serendipitously given the opportunity 3 years ago at my law school to teach property law. I wanted to get into the law school and I thought, oh shit, property law, that sounds like it sucks. And then I realized, wow, this is the platform. And so I've been, as they say in property law, possession is 9/10 of the law. I've been possessing it ever since. And we have, fortunately, we've managed to get like-minded people into that course. We've completely overtaken it, and now we teach it from a radical perspective, starting off by mentioning that all property is theft and moving forward. So I highly recommend everybody in the world to
take your call.
Yes, to take over and occupy property law. So the questions that I thought of, and just to quickly explain about the South African example, I have to admit that I'm one of these appalling people that can hardly see beyond the frontiers of my own state. And in South Africa, the issues are very similar, although relating to a much higher percentage of the population. So before 1994, you effectively had most black people, at least formally, designated to what one could call tribal areas, Bantustan's areas. So that was 80% of the population formally designated to
20% of the land. Obviously, the least fertile and least productive pieces of land, and under tribal authorities of various different forms. And the task since 1994, one of the tasks has been how to address that issue. And part of the problem has been a clash of different property rights. So whereas in the white world, you had individual property rights with market value attached, in the black world you had communal property rights and mediated by tribal authorities and chiefs. And again, issues of not being able to transfer out of that system, but also it representing land use, not ownership. And I do see from the presentations here, you really do have a fundamental clash, and the question is how to get out of it. Because and I'm reminded here of Eddie Izzard. I don't know if anybody knows the British comedian Eddie Izzard, who's got this skit about, you know, when white people came, when colonial authorities came to countries and said, oh, you have a country, do you have a flag? Well, no flag, no country. And, you know, this is the reality now. Property rights, individual property rights, it's almost impossible, I think, to move upstream against that system. So the questions, the briefs of comments or questions I have for anyone in the project, which, by the way, I mean, oh my God, what a great project, and I wish I could have done something comparative, or still would like to be inspired by that. So
that's the next
you know,
question.
yeah, congratulations, it just sounds extremely exciting. So the first thing is, what is a tribal person? Is it an identity thing? In other words, I consider myself to be tribal even if I live in a city and work in a city and sometimes migrate back to the tribal areas, or is it very much area focused? And apart from land, whether there are other consequences and where does the sort of autonomy, identity autonomy, frontier versus the modern states, so for example issues of marriage, inheritance, civil law, etc., boundaries, and which relates to inheritance as well, of course. And then the individual versus community land rights. I heard that there might be some different pictures around that. I think, Namita, you said it's both, but I was wondering how that does operate and what the role of tribal authorities is in terms of mediating this. How does it work? And just to give you the current frontier in South Africa on this, we have expropriation, of course, as every state does, but we also have land reform, land restitution, which attempts to try to reverse this 80%, 20%. You know, it's exactly the flip side of what it should be, because 20% of the people own 80% of the land. And so we have restitution in the form of land claims, and the first land claims process ended in 1998, but it's been reopened again. And although at first blush that would look like a positive thing, because people say so many people didn't have the chance between 94 or 5 and 98 to lay claims, what it now looks like is happening is that our president is appealing to tribal authorities, traditional authorities, and giving them the chance, and their claims are now being prioritized over community claims, because they effectively are the custodians, and the tribal authorities are now going to gain all of this land, many of which has mineral rights on it. So how does that work? The individual versus community versus and as Palak was talking, the opportunity structures, who are the winners, who are the losers, etc., who mediates power in these setups. The governance structures as well, it would be interesting to find out a little bit more about how the governance works. I'm sure it's very different from place to place. Then what about, are there any that you've come across, are there any successful cooperative arrangements between sort of the modern state or modernity and tribal customary areas around conservation projects, or even mines or timber industry? And then a question which I'm not sure whether this project can answer, but do tribals want to retain that way of life? I mean, I know that's a huge generalizing question, but or would they prefer to actually get a slice of the modern way of life by buying into the mineral rights or the timber projects, etc., etc. And related to that is it possible or preferable to retain that way of life? And if it is possible and preferable, what is the best way to safeguard it in terms of property rights? For example, I gather that in Kenya, I'm not sure if Kenyans would agree with this, but I heard somebody giving a presentation last week about how in Kenya there's been this individual titling process, which was thought to be something that would help communities such as this, because one of you mentioned the fact that if there is expropriation of a dam, people are going to get a less than market value, so it's kind of exploitative. So as I understand it, in the Kenyan example, there was an idea that individual titling, so delineation and individual titling would empower. But what it's turned out to do is allow multinationals and countries that are interested in food security to just wholesale buy out. So it's created a market for that land. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jackie. That was a lot of very good and difficult questions. Well, I think we'll just, even if you had many, just take notes, because I see that there are many people who would like to say something. Would you like to say something now or next session?
Oh, next
session. Okay. So, just
let me begin because Jackie has mentioned Kenya, because this project sounds very much like what we have. And some of the questions that I have are probably questions that maybe researchers can answer. And they're like, given these conflicts, what is the way to go? And I think about this in relation to Kenya. And I'll give you two examples. In relation to a community called the Endorois, they have been removed from the tribal area, the land had been made into a national reserve, they didn't get any benefit from it. And they went to court and they eventually ended up at the African Commission, and the Commission said the land should be back to them. But that has never happened because the state has never implemented that decision. But the more troubling question with regard to such communities is, when eventually it does get to be implemented, who benefits from it? From what Kamita and Namita speak about, it will probably eventually end up benefiting not the rank and file, if you like, of the community, but the leadership of the community. With regard to titling and individual titling, and it's again a question that we've grappled with. Among, for instance, the Maasai and similar communities, there was a time we said this land is communal land, so we shall register it in the name of group ranches, so that like a whole community, a whole clan would have a group ranch registered in its name. But of course, there are always those clever, educated people, and at the end of the day, those group ranches end up being largely to the benefit of those larger groupings, and again leaving the individuals, the ordinary person with nothing. Then there's a question of individual titling, and we've taken that to quite some extent in Kenya, because one of the things that you think about here is, if the community, the individuals within the community can get a benefit out of this land when it comes to compensation for that, maybe the adjudication and registration of individual titles is a way to go. But like Jackie says, we've done that. At the end of the day, apart from the multinationals buying out the land and using it for farming, there's also the dispossession of family, because the head of the family, usually the man, will get a title, will sell it, and will move away. Or, as has happened in very many areas of the Rift Valley, they will sell the land, then they will come back and say to the buyer, you cheated me out of my land, and therefore we have the ethnic value. And it's a question that I really don't know how to answer. And I've wondered what what the researchers, or what the thinking has been in India towards resolving this question of the tribal areas. I sense also a lack of other rights for the tribal community. For instance, why is it necessary to have the land being dealt with by the tribal leaders? What is the status of education for these communities? Isn't it a bit of, is it patronizing to say that only certain leaders should be handling this for us? How much do we educate this community so that they know what their rights are in relation to this property? And this is a problem that we also have in Kenya, and I think we don't have a solution to it, and we're still trying to grapple with it in very many areas.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you pointed really to what is the sort of common, really the common challenges that so many countries are facing. And I don't know, I think anybody else wants to come in at this stage, or we'll take a round? Rachel, yeah.
So thank you for the panel. I'm kind of trying to think, I guess we're all thinking from within our states that we work in and think comparatively across it. I wanted to ask a question about international law around Indigenous people's rights, because obviously it's incredibly different from the kind of context we're working in places like Mexico, where there isn't this history of complex legal pluralism from the state and recognition of groups qua indigenous. And I know that the situation is totally different in the other.
Speak a little louder.
Sorry, I know the situation is totally different in the other context that you're talking about, but does international human rights law on indigenous people's rights have any impact on these developments or not? And then the other thing is just to kind of appreciate the fact that you have a dialogue with anthropologists, which of course when you have legal rights adjudicated on the basis of identity are kind of figures that we're going to have to engage with anthropology as a discipline. But methodologically, I wanted to ask how that has worked in the Indian project, because it's quite complicated actually in a lot of the work that we do. So how has that interdisciplinary conversation helped or hindered the kind of work that you're trying to do?
I think we now have okay, Adrian, and then we'll go back to the panel and then go back to you again.
No, just some question. A question came up when I was thinking of the whole setup of the ministry that you talked about. And I was wondering whether actually the ministry is run by the people themselves, or it's run by some experts on the people. Because most of the time people don't get involved in their own decisions because they regard as incapable of making their own decisions. So I was curious to know whether they actually run that ministry, or it's run for them.
I was looking at the watch and saying that we will not be able to get another round, so if anybody else has a question, or want to say something before we go back to the panel, it's now. Okay, very disciplined. I think we'll start sort of by reverse, so that Paul can start out seeing some questions and then can turn them on with that. Yeah.
So, the minister who heads the ministry, his name is Juwal Oram, and his profile, I mean, it was a very interesting question, I'm right. Because it never came across to me, because the federal government works together. The bureaucracy has a system, and the elected parliamentarians, they have a system of reservations for scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. So both the disadvantaged castes in India, because it's a casteist society, as well as the tribes, they have a right to certain positions in government and in educational institutions as a matter of right. They may or may not form part of certain ministries, or they may keep getting transferred in and out like a permanent bureaucracy. Whether the minister himself is a